You repeat the same patterns because you don't see them. The Buddha spent 6 years learning to see clearly, and what he saw were 10 specific causes of suffering. These aren't beliefs or philosophy. They're observations about how your mind creates pain and how to stop creating it. Each lesson addresses one cause, the middle way for extremes, right view for distorted thinking, karma for consequences you can't escape. Tonight you'll hear 10 stories from the Dhammapada commentary, the Jatakas, and the Pali Canon. Stories about a merchant who never rested, a monk who held a snake wrong, an orphan who shared his only meal. Each one shows a pattern and what happens when you finally see it. This works regardless of what you believe. The Buddha didn't teach religion, he taught cause and effect. You're suffering because specific causes are present, and you'll stop when you remove them. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle. Share where you're listening from if you want, but there's no need to. Breathe once with me. Then we'll begin with the first lesson: why the extremes you live in are destroying your peace, and what balance actually means. The middle way starts now. In ancient India, there lived a merchant named Ruhaka who believed rest was theft. While other traders slept, he counted inventory. While they ate leisurely meals, he negotiated deals. While they took holidays, he traveled to distant markets. His competitors admired his work ethic. His family rarely saw him. His body kept sending signals he refused to hear. Ruhaka's business thrived. Warehouses filled with silk, spices, and precious metals. His reputation spread across trade routes from the Ganges to the western seas. People said he had the golden touch, that everything he attempted turned profitable. What they didn't see was the price he paid in a currency that can't be deposited. His wife pleaded with him to slow down. His children grew up barely knowing their father's face. Friends invited him to festivals he never attended, to meals he never shared. Each time someone expressed concern, Ruhaka had the same response. After this next deal, after this busy season, after reaching this financial goal, then he would rest. That future never came because the goals kept moving. One morning, Ruhaka woke before dawn, as always, ready to review shipping manifests. But when he tried to stand, his legs wouldn't hold him. He collapsed back onto his sleeping mat, breath coming in shallow gasps. His chest felt tight, as if an elephant stood on his ribs. Servants rushed to fetch physicians while Ruhaka lay there, finally forced to be still. The doctor examined him and delivered a diagnosis that terrified the merchant more than any financial loss. His body was eating itself from the inside. Years of poor sleep, irregular meals, and constant stress had created damage that wealth couldn't repair. The prescription was simple and impossible. Stop working or die. For 3 months, Ruhaka had no choice but to rest. He watched from his window as others managed his business. He observed how the sun moved across the sky at a pace he'd never noticed. He heard birds he'd lived near for decades, but never truly heard. And slowly, against everything he believed about himself, he began to heal. During those months of forced stillness, something shifted in how Ruhaka saw the world. He noticed his young son learning to walk, falling and rising without frustration. He watched his wife tend the garden, working steadily but never frantically. He observed how the servants accomplished their tasks efficiently during daylight hours, then rested completely at night. Everyone around him seemed to understand something he'd missed. There's a rhythm to sustainable living. But the real change happened when one of his managers came to report. The man looked nervous, clearly afraid to deliver bad news. Ruhaka braced himself for catastrophe. Surely the business had collapsed without his constant oversight. Instead, the manager reported that profits had actually increased. This made no sense to Ruhaka. How could the business thrive without him driving it forward every moment? The manager explained, without Ruhaka's constant pressure to close deals immediately, the staff had time to negotiate better terms. Without rushing to distant markets, they discovered opportunities in nearby towns that cost less to reach. Without exhausted decision-making, they made fewer costly mistakes. The business had been succeeding despite his frantic pace, not because of it. Ruhaka lay there, absorbing this information. His entire life had been built on a belief that turned out to be false. He'd assumed that more effort always meant better results, that rest was laziness, that stopping meant losing ground. But here was proof that extreme effort had actually been hurting what he was trying to build. When he finally recovered enough to return to work, Ruhaka made changes that confused his competitors. He established regular rest days. He stopped traveling during the hottest months. He ate meals at proper times instead of while walking between warehouses. Other merchants whispered that he'd lost his edge, that illness had made him soft. But his business continued growing, and more importantly, he was alive to enjoy it. The Buddha would later point to stories like Ruhaka's when teaching what he called the middle way. This wasn't a compromise or a lukewarm approach to life. It was recognition of a fundamental truth. Extremes destroy what they claim to build. Before his enlightenment, the Buddha himself lived at both extremes. First as a prince with every luxury, where pleasure was pursued until it became empty. Then as an ascetic who starved himself nearly to death, believing suffering would lead to awakening. Neither extreme brought him any closer to understanding. He practiced with such intensity that his skin turned dark, his bones jutted out, His hair fell from his head. Other ascetics revered him as the most dedicated among them. But dedication to the wrong approach doesn't produce right results. He was destroying his body without gaining any insight into the nature of suffering or its end. The breakthrough came when he accepted food from a village woman and stopped torturing his body. Not because he gave up, but because he finally saw that the path wasn't found at either pole. It existed in the balance between them, not as a compromise, but as a completely different way of being. This is what Ruhaka discovered in his forced rest. The middle way isn't about doing less work. It's about understanding that sustainable effort outperforms unsustainable intensity every time. A farmer who plants seeds and then waters them doesn't dig them up every hour to check on growth. That checking, that inability to let natural processes unfold, would kill the very thing he's trying to cultivate. Look at your own life right now. Notice the places where you've gone to extremes. Maybe you work until exhaustion sets in, believing that's what dedication looks like. Or perhaps you've swung the other direction, avoiding effort entirely because it feels too demanding. The middle way asks you to examine whether either extreme is actually serving you. This applies to everything. Eating until you're stuffed damages your body, but so does starving it. Sleeping 12 hours a day leaves you groggy, but so does chronic sleep deprivation. Exercising until you injure yourself defeats the purpose, but complete inactivity creates its own harm. The wisdom is in finding the sustainable point between extremes. But here's what makes the middle way difficult. It requires constant adjustment. There's no fixed formula you can follow forever. What's balanced for you at 25 might be extreme at 50. What works during a crisis might not work during calm periods. You have to pay attention to actual results rather than following rigid rules. Ruhaka learned this through feedback from his own body. The chest pains, the collapsed legs, the shallow breathing, these were messages he'd been ignoring for years. His body had been trying to teach him about balance, but he'd been too committed to his extreme approach to listen. Only when he had no choice did he finally hear what had been true all along. You're receiving similar messages right now. Your body knows when you've pushed too hard or not enough. The exhaustion that won't lift, the constant low-grade anxiety, the inability to enjoy things you once loved, these aren't character flaws. They're signals that you've drifted too far toward one extreme or another. The Buddha taught that the middle way isn't passive. It's actively intelligent. It means observing what actually works, rather than what should work, according to your beliefs. Ruhaka believed rest was weakness, until his body proved him wrong. How many of your own beliefs about what's necessary are actually creating the problems you're trying to solve? Consider modern work culture, We celebrate people who boast about 4 hours of sleep, who check emails at midnight, who never take vacations. We call this dedication, ambition, success. But the research shows what the Buddha taught 25 centuries ago: chronic overwork decreases productivity, creativity, and decision-making quality. The person who works 60 hours a week often produces less valuable output than someone working 40, because exhaustion creates mistakes, missed insights, and burnout. Yet the opposite extreme doesn't work either. Complete avoidance of effort, constant seeking of comfort, refusing any challenge. This creates its own suffering. Skills atrophy, confidence erodes, life becomes small and fearful. The middle way isn't about choosing comfort over effort. It's about right effort, the kind that builds rather than destroys. Think of a guitar string, too loose, and it produces no sound. Too tight, and it snaps. But at exactly the right tension, it creates music. Your life works the same way. You're looking for that precise tension where growth happens without breaking. Ruhaka found his balance through crisis. You don't have to wait for collapse to make adjustments. Start noticing the feedback you're already receiving. When do you feel energized versus depleted? When does effort feel productive versus futile? When does rest restore you versus leave you more tired? These signals show you where your personal middle way lives. The teaching here isn't complicated. Extremes create suffering. Balance creates sustainability. But living this truth requires constant awareness, because the pull toward extremes is strong. Your mind likes absolute rules. Always work hard. Never show weakness. More is always better. These rules are easier than the nuanced intelligence the middle way demands. But that intelligence is available to you right now. You already know when you've pushed too hard. You already know when you're avoiding what needs doing. The wisdom isn't mysterious. It's in the feedback your body and life keep giving you. The question is whether you'll listen before the crisis forces you to. Ruhaka's story doesn't end with perfect balance forever after. Life isn't static. There were times he needed to work intensely, and times he needed more rest. The skill he developed wasn't finding one perfect formula. It was learning to adjust constantly based on real conditions, rather than fixed beliefs. This is the middle way the Buddha taught. Not a rigid path between two extremes, but an intelligent responsiveness to what each moment actually requires. Sometimes that means working hard. Sometimes it means stopping completely. The wisdom is in knowing which is needed now. The middle way isn't just about work. It's about how you see reality itself, which brings us to the second lesson the Buddha taught, one that addresses why we suffer even when we think we're seeing clearly. A man was walking through tall grass when he saw what appeared to be a stick lying across the path. Without thinking, he reached down and grabbed it by one end to move it aside. The stick was actually a snake, and because he'd grabbed it by the tail, instead of safely behind the head, it whipped around and bit him. He dropped it immediately, the pain sharp and immediate, his arm already beginning to swell. The snake slithered away into the grass, neither malicious nor forgiving, simply responding to being grabbed dangerously. The Buddha used this image when teaching about wrong view, seeing reality incorrectly, and then acting on that incorrect perception. The man wasn't stupid or careless. He simply saw something that wasn't there and responded to his perception rather than to what was actually present. The snake didn't bite him because it was evil. It bit him because that's what snakes do when grabbed dangerously. This is how most human suffering works. You're not being punished by life. You're experiencing the natural consequences of seeing things incorrectly and acting on those incorrect perceptions. The Buddha taught that right view, seeing things as they actually are, is the foundation of the entire path to freedom from suffering. Without it, everything else you try will be like grabbing more snakes by the tail. You might have good intentions, you might work hard, you might be sincere in your efforts, but if you're seeing reality incorrectly, your actions will create more suffering. So what does it mean to see things as they really are? The Buddha wasn't talking about some mystical vision or supernatural insight. He meant seeing the basic facts of existence that are true whether you notice them or not. First, everything changes. Not eventually, not in some distant future, but constantly. The body you're in right now is not the same body you woke up in this morning. Cells have died and been replaced. Chemical balances have shifted. Injuries have healed or worsened. The thoughts you're thinking now are already different from the thoughts you had a moment ago. Yet you treat your body and mind as if they're fixed things, then feel shocked and betrayed when they age or change or fail to remain consistent. This is wrong view, not because you're morally wrong to feel shocked, but because your shock comes from seeing permanence where there is only constant change. You grabbed the snake thinking it was a stick. Second, everything is connected to everything else. Nothing exists in isolation. Your mood right now depends on your sleep last night, which depended on your stress yesterday, which depended on that conversation last week, which depended on patterns formed in childhood, which depended on your parents' experiences, which depended on their culture, which depended on historical events, which depended on geological and evolutionary processes, stretching back billions of years. When you think, I chose to feel this way, you're seeing a stick where there's a snake. Your choices emerge from countless conditions you didn't choose and often don't see. This doesn't mean you have no agency. It means your agency operates within a vast web of causes you didn't create. Third, clinging to anything causes suffering. Not might cause suffering, not sometimes causes suffering, but always and inevitably creates suffering. You cling to youth and suffer as you age. You cling to health and suffer when illness comes. You cling to relationships and suffer when they change or end. You cling to your self-image and suffer whenever reality contradicts it. The suffering doesn't come from the aging, illness, or change itself. It comes from wanting reality to be different than it is. This is like repeatedly grabbing the snake by the tail, while insisting it should behave like a stick. Most people spend their entire lives operating from wrong view without realizing it. They see sticks everywhere and keep getting bitten by snakes. Then they conclude that life is fundamentally unfair, that they're cursed, that happiness is impossible, that other people have it easier. But look closer at what's actually happening. Someone insults you, and you suffer for days. The suffering isn't in the words. Those are just sounds that already vanished into silence. The suffering is in your belief that the insult means something permanent about your worth, that you've been damaged by it, that you need to do something to fix what's been broken. Wrong view sees a stick. This insult has harmed me. Right view sees the snake. Thoughts about the insult are creating suffering in this present moment, and I'm grasping those thoughts as if they're solid truth. Someone praises you and you feel temporarily good, then anxious about whether you deserve it, then worried about maintaining the standard, then deflated when the good feeling fades. Wrong view sees praise as something solid you can possess. Right view sees praise as sounds and thoughts that arise and pass, creating pleasant and unpleasant sensations that also arise and pass. The Buddha wasn't being pessimistic when he taught this. He was being accurate. And accuracy is what allows you to stop getting bitten. Think about how you see your thoughts. Most people treat thoughts as truth. A thought appears, "I'm not good enough," and you automatically believe it, feel the emotional impact, act on the assumption that it's accurately describing reality. You don't question whether the thought is true any more than you'd question whether a chair is there when you see it. This is grabbing the snake by the tail. The thought isn't truth. It's a mental event, no more inherently true than a dream or a random worry. But because you see it as truth, you suffer accordingly. Or consider how you see other people. You create a mental image. She's judgmental. He's unreliable. They don't care about me. And then you relate to your image rather than to the actual, changing, complex person in front of you. They do something that contradicts your image, and you either dismiss it as an exception or get confused and frustrated. Your image becomes a cage that limits how you can interact with the real person standing before you. Wrong view again. You're seeing a fixed stick where there's a constantly changing, multifaceted snake. The bite comes when you act on your fixed image, and reality doesn't cooperate. The Buddha taught that wrong view is the root of all other problems. If you see clearly, you naturally act in ways that reduce suffering. If you see incorrectly, even your attempts to help yourself will backfire. Take addiction as an example. Wrong view sees the substance or behavior as the source of pleasure, relief, or escape. So the solution seems to be willpower. Just stop using. Just control yourself. Just be stronger. But this is fighting the snake you think is a stick. Right view sees that you're using the substance to escape from uncomfortable sensations that arise from deeper patterns of wrong view. You believe certain feelings are unbearable, certain truths are too painful to face, certain aspects of yourself are unacceptable. These beliefs create suffering, and the substance temporarily masks that suffering. The solution isn't willpower. It's changing the underlying views that create the suffering you're trying to escape. When you see clearly that no feeling is actually unbearable, that truth is less painful than avoidance, that all aspects of experience are workable, the compulsion naturally decreases. This is what the Buddha meant by right view as the foundation of the path. You can practice meditation, follow precepts, cultivate kindness, but if you're still seeing sticks where there are snakes, you'll keep getting bitten. So how do you develop right view? Not by thinking differently or adopting new beliefs, but by observing reality directly until you see what's actually there. Notice impermanence in real time. Watch how your mood shifts from moment to moment. Observe how the sensation you called anger is actually a changing cluster of heat, tension, and racing thoughts. See how the person you're talking to is different now than they were 5 minutes ago. Notice how the breath changes with each inhale and exhale, never exactly the same twice. Don't think about impermanence. See it happening. Notice interconnection directly. Trace backward from your current emotion to what triggered it, to what made you sensitive to that trigger, to what created that sensitivity. Follow forward from your actions to their ripple effects on others, on yourself tomorrow, on the patterns you're reinforcing. See how your words change the person listening, how their response changes you, how the whole interaction emerged from conditions neither of you fully controlled. Don't philosophize about interconnection. Observe the actual web of causes and effects. Notice how clinging feels. Not what you're clinging to, but the actual sensation of grasping, of trying to hold on to something or push something away. Feel the tension in that, the exhaustion, the way it never quite works, because what you're grasping keeps changing or slipping away. This isn't a concept. It's a visceral experience you can learn to recognize. The man who grabbed the snake learned his lesson instantly. The bite was immediate feedback that his perception had been wrong. You're getting similar feedback constantly, but you often don't connect the bite to the wrong perception that caused it. You see the criticism as the problem, rather than your belief that criticism can damage your fundamental worth. You see the other person as the problem, rather than your expectation that they should be different than they are. You see the circumstances as the problem, rather than your resistance to the circumstances. Each bite is trying to teach you where you're still seeing incorrectly. The suffering isn't punishment, it's information. It's showing you where you grabbed the snake by the tail. This doesn't mean you caused your suffering through moral failure. It means you're experiencing the natural consequence of wrong view, just as the man experienced the natural consequence of seeing a stick where there was a snake. He didn't deserve the bite. He simply got bitten because that's what happens when you misperceive snakes. The Buddha's teaching isn't about blame. It's about accuracy. See things as they actually are, and suffering decreases. Continue seeing them incorrectly, and suffering continues. Right view changes everything because it changes the foundation from which you act. When you see clearly that your worth isn't dependent on others' opinions, criticism loses its power to devastate you. When you see clearly that clinging creates suffering, you naturally hold things more lightly. When you see clearly that everything changes, you stop being shocked by change and start working with it. This seeing isn't a one-time event. You don't suddenly see perfectly and then you're done. It's a gradual clearing, like fog lifting slowly from a landscape. First you see the outlines, then more details, then finer distinctions. Each layer of clearer seeing reduces suffering and increases your ability to see even more clearly. The man with the snake learned to look more carefully at sticks before grabbing them. You can learn to look more carefully at your perceptions before treating them as truth. Is this thought actually accurate, or is it a habitual pattern? Is this person actually how I'm seeing them, or am I relating to my mental image? Is this feeling actually unbearable, or is it just uncomfortable? These questions help you see the snake before you grab it by the tail. Seeing clearly changes everything. But what about the actions we take based on what we see? That's where the third lesson becomes crucial. Understanding how your actions shape your future in ways you can't escape. There was once a wealthy man in the city of Rajagaha, whose fortune exceeded that of most merchants in the kingdom. His warehouses overflowed with grain, his vaults held gold, his estate employed dozens of servants. Yet when his wife gave birth to a son, something strange happened inside the father's heart. A tightness formed that he couldn't explain, a resistance to sharing even the smallest portion of his wealth with this child. The boy was named Matakundali, and from the moment of his birth, his father's miserliness toward him was absolute. While the household ate well-prepared meals, the boy received scraps. While servants wore decent clothing, Matakundali wore rags. The father couldn't bring himself to spend a single coin on proper food or care for his own son, though he had more than enough to feed 100 children luxuriously. The mother pleaded, relatives questioned, servants whispered, but the father's irrational stinginess toward the boy only hardened with each passing year. He would give to temples, host feasts for guests, donate to the poor, but for his own child, he felt only a strange compulsion to withhold. Matakundali grew weak and thin, his body never developing properly because nutrition never came. By the time he reached 16, he looked like a child of 8, frail and hollow-eyed. Then he fell ill with a fever that might have been treatable with proper food and medicine. The father, true to his pattern, refused to call physicians or provide remedies. He watched his son waste away, day by day, some part of him wanting to help, but a stronger part unable to open his hand. Within a week, Matakundali died in that house of abundance, having never known a full meal or a father's generosity. The Buddha happened to be staying nearby when this occurred. Word of the strange death reached him. A wealthy man's son, starving to death while surrounded by plenty. People couldn't understand it. What kind of father watches his child die rather than share his wealth? The Buddha explained what most people couldn't see. This wasn't random cruelty or simple greed. It was the visible manifestation of a pattern that had been set in motion lifetimes before. In a previous life, Matakundali had been a wealthy man himself. One day, he'd prepared an elaborate meal and was about to eat when a monk appeared at his door, requesting alms. The wealthy man looked at his food, looked at the monk, and made a choice. Rather than share even a portion, he threw the entire meal into the river, preferring to waste it than give it to someone who needed it. That single action of deliberate waste, choosing destruction over generosity, created a pattern that followed him across lifetimes. The consciousness that made that choice carried the imprint forward. In this life, he experienced the receiving end of that same withholding he'd once enacted. This is what the Buddha meant by karma, not cosmic punishment administered by some judgmental universe, but the simple continuation of patterns you yourself create through intentional action. The word karma means action, specifically intentional action. Not every action creates lasting patterns, reflexes, accidents. Things done without awareness leave little trace. But when you act with clear intention, especially when that action is repeated, you're literally training your consciousness to operate in certain ways. Think of it like this. Every time you respond to frustration with anger, you're strengthening the neural pathways that lead to anger. You're making it easier for anger to arise next time and harder for other responses to emerge. This isn't mystical. It's how the brain works, how habits form, how patterns become ingrained. The man who wasted food to spite a monk trained himself in withholding and waste. That training didn't disappear when his body died. The pattern continued in the next consciousness that arose, carrying forward the imprint of that training. And in this new life, the pattern manifested from a different angle. Instead of being the one who withholds, he became the one who experiences withholding. The father's inexplicable miserliness toward his own child wasn't a character flaw or mental illness. It was karma ripening, the consequence of an intentional action finding its way back to the consciousness that created it. This teaching disturbs people when they first hear it. It sounds like blaming victims, like saying people deserve their suffering. But the Buddha wasn't making moral judgments. He was describing cause and effect in the realm of intentional action. You plant apple seeds, you get apple trees. You plant thistle seeds, you get thistles. This isn't the universe rewarding apples and punishing thistles. It's just how seeds work. Intentional actions are seeds that produce corresponding results. The crucial word is intentional. The man didn't accidentally drop the food in the river. He deliberately chose waste over generosity, spite over kindness. That intention is what created the karmic pattern, not the physical action itself. This means you're creating your future right now with every intentional choice you make. Not your circumstances necessarily. You can't karma your way into winning the lottery or avoiding all hardship. But you're shaping how you'll relate to whatever circumstances arise. Every time you choose patience over reactivity, you're making patience more accessible in the future. Every time you choose honesty over deception, even when deception seems easier, you're strengthening the pattern of honesty. Every time you choose generosity over hoarding, you're training consciousness in the direction of openness rather than grasping. The opposite is equally true. Each time you indulge anger, you make anger stronger. Each time you lie to avoid discomfort, you make lying more likely next time. Each time you take what isn't freely given, you deepen the pattern of taking. These aren't abstract, spiritual principles. You can observe this directly in your own life. Notice how certain reactions have become automatic because you've repeated them so many times. Notice how some choices that once required effort now happen without thinking, because you've reinforced them into habits. That's karma in action. You're not being controlled by some external force. You're experiencing the momentum of your own past intentions. Mata Kundali's story shows the extreme version, a pattern so strong it carried across lifetimes and manifested as a father's inexplicable cruelty. But you don't need to believe in rebirth to understand the principle. In this single life, you're constantly experiencing the results of patterns you've created through repeated, intentional action. The person who spent years reacting to stress with alcohol now finds that alcohol is the first thing their mind reaches for when difficulty arises. The person who repeatedly chose work over relationships now finds themselves isolated with successful careers, but no one to share them with. The person who trained themselves to see threats everywhere now lives in constant anxiety, even when objectively safe. None of this is punishment. It's pattern playing out, momentum continuing, seeds sprouting into plants that match the seeds that were sown. The question is, what are you planting now? Because here's what the Buddha discovered that makes this teaching liberating rather than depressing. You can change the pattern, starting with the next intentional action. You're not doomed to repeat the past forever. Mata Kundali couldn't change the pattern that led to his death, that karma had already ripened. But if his consciousness continues, if there's another life after that one, the experience of starving, while surrounded by plenty, will itself create new patterns. Perhaps patterns of compassion for those who suffer, of understanding what withholding feels like from the receiving end. You don't need to wait for another lifetime. Right now, in this moment, you can choose an action that contradicts your habitual pattern. The person who always reacts with anger can choose patience, even once. The person who habitually lies can tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. The person who hoards can give something away, even something small. That single contrary action doesn't erase the old pattern immediately. The grooves are deep from years of repetition, but it plants a new seed. It creates a tiny bit of momentum in a different direction. And if you repeat that new action, make it intentional, choose it again and again, despite the pull of the old habit, you're creating a new pattern that will eventually become as strong as the old one. This is how transformation actually happens, not through insight alone, not through understanding intellectually, but through intentional action, repeated until it becomes the new default. The Buddha wasn't teaching fatalism when he explained karma. He was teaching responsibility and possibility. You created these patterns through your past actions, which means you can create different patterns through your current actions. Look at your life right now, the difficulties you're facing, the ease in certain areas, the relationships you have, the habits that run you, All of this emerged from past intentional actions, yours and others. You didn't choose your starting point, your genetics, your childhood circumstances, but you've been choosing your responses to those conditions every day since you became capable of choice. Those responses created patterns that led to this present moment, and this present moment offers you the chance to choose responses that will create different patterns leading to different futures. The man who wasted food could have chosen differently. He could have shared with the monk, created a pattern of generosity that would follow him forward. Instead, he chose spite, and that choice echoed across lifetimes. You're making similar choices constantly, though usually with less dramatic results. The choice to snap at your partner or respond with kindness. The choice to work with integrity or cut corners. The choice to face difficulty or numb yourself against it. Each choice is a seed. Each seed will sprout. You will experience what grows from what you're planting right now. This isn't meant to make you paranoid about every action. It's meant to wake you up to the power you actually have. You're not a victim of random forces. You're experiencing the results of patterned forces you yourself have created and continue to create with every intentional choice. The good news is that you can start creating better patterns immediately. You don't need permission, special circumstances, or ideal conditions. You just need to make one intentional choice that contradicts the harmful pattern, then another, then another. The father in the story was trapped by a pattern so strong he couldn't break it even to save his son's life. You may have patterns that feel equally unbreakable, but they're only unbreakable if you never choose differently. If you let momentum continue unchallenged. Your past shaped today. There's no escaping that. The patterns you created through years of repeated choices are playing out right now in your circumstances, your reactions, your relationships. But what about the time you have left? What patterns will you choose to create starting with your next intentional action? Among the Buddha's monks, there was one who stood out for all the wrong reasons. His name was Lakunataka Badia, and he was a dwarf, barely reaching the shoulders of other men. His face was so misshapen that children sometimes cried when they saw him, and his body was twisted in ways that made simple movement difficult. Other monks whispered about him. Visitors to the monastery stared. Even those who meant no harm couldn't help but notice how different he looked, how awkward his presence was in gatherings of more typical men. Yet Lakuntataka Badia walked through all of this with something that baffled everyone who encountered him: pure, unshakable joy. He would wake before dawn and greet the day by saying aloud, "Oh happiness, oh happiness." He said it while sweeping the monastery grounds, while eating his simple meal, while sitting in meditation. Oh happiness, not as a mantra, he was forcing himself to repeat, but as a genuine expression of what he felt. The other monks found this deeply confusing. Here was a man with every reason to be bitter, poor, ugly, physically limited, subject to mockery and pity in equal measure. Yet he radiated more contentment than men who were healthy, attractive, and accomplished. How could someone in his position possibly be happy? Finally, several monks went to the Buddha with their question. "Master, we don't understand Lakuntaka Bhadia. He has nothing that people usually associate with happiness. Yet, he's the most joyful person we know. Every day he says, 'Oh happiness,' as if he's living in paradise. What causes this?" The Buddha smiled, recognizing the teaching opportunity in their confusion. "You want to know why Bhadia is happy? Then you need to understand where he's coming from." He explained that in Bhadia's previous life, the man had been a cruel and violent criminal. His actions had led to capture, and he'd been sentenced to execution by torture, a process designed to maximize suffering before death. For days, he experienced unimaginable physical pain as executioners slowly took his life, using methods too brutal to describe. When that consciousness ended and a new life began, the imprint of that torture remained. Bhadia was born into this life with a body that reflected some of that past suffering, twisted, limited, causing him social pain to mirror the physical pain of before. But here's what the other monks had missed. Compared to being actively tortured to death, every single moment of this life was absolute bliss. No one was driving nails into his flesh. No one was burning him or crushing his bones. He could breathe freely. He could eat when hungry. He could sleep without fear of waking to more agony. People might stare or whisper, but they weren't trying to kill him slowly. From this perspective, every ordinary moment was a gift beyond measure. The simple act of walking through the monastery garden was bliss. He wasn't being tortured. Eating plain rice was bliss. He wasn't being tortured. Being mocked by others was bliss. He wasn't being tortured. Oh, happiness wasn't empty optimism or spiritual bypassing. It was accurate assessment of his actual experience compared to what he'd known before. The Buddha used Bhadia's story to teach something crucial about how we experience life. Your happiness or suffering isn't determined by objective circumstances. It's determined by what you compare those circumstances to. Bhadia compared everything to being tortured to death and found every moment wonderful. The other monks compared their lives to idealized fantasies and found themselves lacking. Same monastery, same food, same teaching, completely different experience, based entirely on the frame of reference each person was using. You're doing this constantly without realizing it. You compare your body to magazine covers and feel inadequate. You compare your career to highlight reels on social media and feel like a failure. You compare your relationship to movie romance and feel disappointed. These comparisons create suffering, not because your actual circumstances are bad, but because you're measuring them against impossible standards that exist only in your imagination. But what if you changed the comparison? What if you compared your current life to the worst day you've ever experienced? What if you compared it to the lives of people throughout history who suffered in ways you've never known? What if you compared it to the very real possibility of not existing at all? Suddenly, the same circumstances that seemed inadequate become grounds for the same joy Buddha expressed. You're not being tortured. You're not starving. You're not dying of untreatable disease. You're breathing, thinking, capable of experiencing this moment. Oh happiness, oh happiness. This isn't about pretending problems don't exist or invalidating real difficulties. Buddha's physical limitations were real. The mockery he endured was real. But he'd learned something most people never learn, that gratitude for what you have is more powerful than resentment for what you lack. The Buddha taught this as part of death awareness, keeping present the fact that life is temporary and therefore precious. Not morbid dwelling on death, but clear recognition that you won't be here forever, which makes now valuable in a way it can't be if you assume there's always more time. When you truly absorb that this day might be your last, it changes how you move through it. The petty irritations lose their power. The grudges you've been holding seem pointless. The appreciation you've been postponing until things are perfect becomes urgent. Buddha lived every day as if it were a gift, because he remembered, at some level, what it felt like when days were running out in agony. You don't need to wait for a near-death experience to access this same clarity. You just need to be honest about the fact that your time is limited, and this moment will never come again. Right now, wherever you are, you're experiencing conditions that billions of people throughout history would consider miraculous. You're probably not hungry to the point of starvation. You're probably not in severe physical pain. You have access to knowledge that would have seemed like magic a century ago. You can communicate with people across the planet instantly, cure diseases that used to be death sentences, travel distances that used to take months in a matter of hours. None of this guarantees happiness, because happiness isn't about circumstances. It's about perception. Buddha with nothing was joyful. The other monks with much more were restless and unsatisfied. The difference was in how they saw what they had. You can test this right now. Take a moment and compare your current situation to the worst moment of your life. If you're reading this or listening to it, you're not in that worst moment anymore. You survived it. You're here, conscious, capable of receiving these words. Compared to your worst day, how is this moment? Now compare your situation to someone experiencing extreme suffering right now, someone dying alone, someone being tortured, someone watching their children starve. These aren't hypothetical situations. They're happening to real people as you receive these words. Compared to their experience, how is yours? This isn't meant to make you feel guilty for having it easier. It's meant to wake you up to what you actually have, that you've been treating as insufficient. The comparison isn't about others' suffering. It's about your own perception. Buddha's past life torture gave him a reference point that made everything else feel like bliss. You probably don't have that extreme contrast in your direct experience. But you do have imagination, memory, and the ability to recognize that your current circumstances could be much worse. The Buddha wasn't teaching toxic positivity or spiritual bypassing when he pointed to Buddha as an example. He was showing how happiness emerges from realistic perception rather than circumstantial perfection. Buddha's life wasn't objectively wonderful, but his perception of it was accurate. Compared to being tortured to death, every moment was indeed happiness. This is living each day fully, not by cramming it with experiences or achievements, but by actually recognizing what you're experiencing right now as valuable simply because you're experiencing it. You're alive. That fact alone, when seen clearly, is extraordinary. Most people live as if they have unlimited time, saving their appreciation for some future moment when everything aligns perfectly. Then they die having never fully inhabited any of the moments they actually had, because they were always waiting for better ones. Buddha didn't make this mistake. He knew somehow that this moment was all he had, and that was enough. You're making a choice right now about how to see this day. You can compare it to an imagined perfect day and find it lacking. You can compare it to others' curated presentations of their lives and feel inadequate. Or you can compare it to the very real possibility of not having this day at all and find it precious. Buddha chose the third option every single day. Oh, happiness wasn't denial of his difficulties. It was recognition that difficulties are vastly preferable to non-existence or active torture. That recognition didn't change his circumstances, but it completely changed his experience of those circumstances. The teaching here is simple, but not easy. Your experience of life depends more on your frame of reference than on your actual conditions. Change the comparison and you change the experience. Not by lying to yourself about what's true, but by choosing to compare what you have to realistic alternatives rather than impossible fantasies. Death will come for you, not someday in the distant future, soon, by the measure of how time actually feels as you age. Every day that passes is one you'll never get back, one fewer you have remaining. This isn't morbid, it's simply true. Buddha lived with this truth active in his awareness. Each day was precious, not because it was perfect, but because it was finite, and he was experiencing it instead of the torture his previous actions had earned. You don't need a dramatic backstory to access the same awareness. You just need to be honest about impermanence. This moment will end. Today will end. Your life will end. You can resist this truth and suffer from the resistance, or you can accept it and let it show you the value of what you're experiencing right now. Each day is precious, but knowing that intellectually doesn't change how you live. The question is how you actually transform yourself from someone who takes life for granted into someone who meets each moment with Buddha's simple recognition. Oh, happiness, I'm alive and not being tortured. What could be better than this? There were two brothers who wanted to become monks. The elder brother, Mahapantaka, had a quick mind and sharp memory. Within weeks of joining the monastery, he'd memorized hundreds of verses and grasped complex teachings with ease. His younger brother, Kulapanthaka, was different. Kulapantaka struggled with everything. When teachers gave him a single verse to memorize, he'd repeat it all day and forget it by evening. When they explained a simple concept, it slipped through his mind like water through a sieve. After 4 months of trying, he still couldn't remember even one complete teaching. The other monks grew frustrated. They'd spend hours teaching him the same verse, watching him nod and repeat it back, then seeing him blank completely when asked to recite it the next morning. Finally, Mahapanthaka took his brother aside with painful news. "You're not suited for this life," he said, trying to be kind but firm. "Some people have the mental capacity for these teachings and some don't. You've tried for months and you can't even memorize a single verse. It's better to accept your limitations and return to ordinary life than to embarrass yourself further here." Kulapanthaka sat outside the monastery gates and wept. He knew his brother was right. He was slow, dull, incapable of what came easily to others. But the teachings had touched something in him that his limited mind couldn't explain. He didn't want to leave, even though he was clearly failing. The Buddha happened to pass by and saw the young man crying. When he learned what had happened, he called Kulapanthaka over. "Your brother says you can't learn," the Buddha said. "Is this true?" "Yes, Master," Kulapanthaka admitted, his voice heavy with shame. "I've tried for 4 months, and I still can't remember even one verse. My mind doesn't work like other people's minds." The Buddha looked at him carefully, Can you do one simple thing and keep doing it? I think so, Kulapanthaka said uncertainly. The Buddha handed him a clean white cloth. Sit here and wipe this cloth, he instructed. As you wipe it, say these words: remove dust, remove dust. That's all. Can you do this? Kulapanthaka nodded. It seemed simple enough even for someone as slow as him. So he sat there in the corner of the monastery and wiped the cloth. Remove dust, he said with each stroke. The cloth collected dirt from his hands, from the air, from the surface where he worked. He'd wipe it clean, then it would gather dust again, and he'd wipe it again. Hours passed, days passed, weeks passed. While other monks studied complex philosophy and debated subtle points of doctrine, Kulapanthaka wiped his cloth. Remove dust, remove dust. The other monks walked past him and shook their heads. Here was proof of what they'd said. The boy was so simple that all he could handle was this mindless task. Even Mahapanthaka felt embarrassed by his brother's presence, this constant reminder of intellectual limitation. But something was happening that no one else could see. As Kulapanthaka wiped the cloth day after day, saying the same words thousands of times, his mind began to settle. The racing thoughts that had made memorization impossible started to slow. The anxiety about being stupid began to fade. He noticed that dust appeared on the cloth constantly. He'd wipe it completely clean, and within moments, new dust would settle. The cloth was never permanently clean. Cleaning it was an ongoing process, not a final achievement. Then one day, after months of wiping, a question formed in his quiet mind. If this cloth is never permanently clean, what else is like this? He looked at his own mind and saw the same pattern. Thoughts arose like dust settling on cloth. He could remove a thought, feel clear for a moment, then new thoughts would appear. The mind was never permanently clean. It required constant attention, just like the cloth. And deeper still, what was this dust he'd been commanded to remove? Physical dust on the cloth, yes, but also greed, anger, and delusion settling constantly on consciousness. Remove dust, not once, but continuously, moment after moment. In that simple realization, earned through months of repetitive practice that everyone else had dismissed as pointless, Kulapanthaka understood what the brilliant monks were still trying to grasp through complex study. The path wasn't about accumulating knowledge. It was about the patient, continuous removal of what obscures clarity. He achieved full enlightenment sitting there with his cloth, becoming an awakened being through the simplest practice imaginable. The slow-minded monk who couldn't memorize a single verse had understood the entire teaching by doing one thing completely. When the Buddha told the other monks what had happened, they were stunned. How could someone so dull achieve what they, with all their learning and sharp minds, had not? The Buddha used Kulapanthaka as an example of how transformation actually happens. Not through dramatic breakthroughs or sudden insight, but through small, consistent actions, repeated until they reveal truth. The brilliant monks had been trying to swallow the ocean in one gulp, accumulating teachings faster than they could integrate them. Kulapanthaka had taken one drop and investigated it completely until that single drop revealed the nature of the entire ocean. This is how wisdom actually builds, not through grand gestures or intense bursts of effort that can't be sustained, but through small steps taken consistently in the same direction. You live in a culture that promises instant transformation, 7-day cleanses, weekend workshops that claim to revolutionize your life, apps that guarantee meditation mastery in 10 minutes a day. The underlying message is that change should be fast, dramatic, and easy. But Kulapanthaka's story reveals how change actually works. He didn't achieve enlightenment through an intensive retreat or a powerful revelation. He achieved it by wiping a cloth and saying 2 words thousands upon thousands of times until the repetition wore through his mental resistance and revealed what was always true. The monks who rejected him were smarter, more capable, better educated, yet their brilliance became an obstacle because it made them impatient with simple practices. They wanted advanced teachings, sophisticated techniques, complex philosophies to match their complex minds. Kulapanthaka had no choice but to be simple, because his mind couldn't handle complexity. That limitation became his liberation. He couldn't skip steps or jump to advanced practices, so he did the one simple thing he was given with complete attention. You probably have more intellectual capacity than Kulapanthaka. The question is whether your greater capacity is helping you or hindering you. Are you using it to practice consistently or to jump between techniques looking for the perfect one? Are you building on small gains or dismissing them as insufficient because they don't match the dramatic transformations you've been promised? Think about something you want to change in your life. Maybe you want to be calmer, more patient, less reactive. The Kulapanthaka approach would be finding one tiny action you can repeat daily that moves you microscopically in that direction. Not a dramatic overhaul of your personality, not an intensive program that requires hours of daily practice you can't sustain. Just one small thing, done consistently, like wiping a cloth and saying, "Remove dust." Maybe it's taking 3 conscious breaths before responding to frustration. Maybe it's pausing 1 second before checking your phone. Maybe it's noticing one moment of gratitude each morning. These actions seem laughably small compared to the change you want. But Kula Panthaka's task seemed laughably small too. Wipe a cloth and say 2 words. How could that possibly lead to enlightenment? Yet it did, because he stayed with it long enough for it to work on him at a level deeper than his conscious understanding. The modern obsession with efficiency works against this kind of transformation. You want to optimize, find the fastest route, eliminate wasted time. But wisdom isn't built efficiently. It's built through repetition that looks wasteful until suddenly it isn't. Kula Panthaka wiped the same cloth for months. An efficiency expert would call that absurd. Surely there was a faster way to learn what he needed to learn. But there wasn't, not for him, because his transformation required the dissolution that only comes from doing something simple so many times that your resistance to simplicity breaks down. You give up too soon. You try a practice for a week, don't see dramatic results, and conclude it doesn't work. You start building a new habit, encounter difficulty on day 3, and abandon it for something that promises easier progress. Kula Panthaka would still have been wiping his cloth when you'd already moved on to the next technique. He'd still be saying, remove dust, while you were reading books about more advanced practices. And he'd achieve enlightenment while you were still searching for the right method. This isn't about being stubborn or rigid. It's about understanding that real change happens below the surface of your awareness. You're doing something simple, seeing no obvious progress, feeling like you're wasting time. But underneath, patterns are shifting, resistances are wearing down, insights are forming that will eventually surface as transformation. The Buddha gave Kula Panthaka exactly what he needed, not what he wanted, not what seemed impressive, but what would actually work, given his specific capacities and limitations. A simple task he could sustain indefinitely until it revealed its teaching. What's your cloth to wipe? What's the simple thing you could do every single day, regardless of how you feel, whether you see progress, or what more advanced practitioners are doing? Not the optimal practice, not the most powerful technique, just the one thing simple enough that you'll actually do it consistently for months or years until it transforms you. Kula Panthaka couldn't have succeeded at complex practices even if he'd tried. His limitation forced him into simplicity, and simplicity forced him into depth. You have the opposite problem. Your capability tempts you into complexity, and complexity keeps you on the surface of many practices instead of in the depth of one. Small steps build wisdom, not because small steps are inherently wise, but because they're sustainable. And sustainability over time is what allows compound effects to work. Kulapantaka's first day of wiping the cloth accomplished almost nothing. His 100th day wasn't dramatically different. But by day 300, something had shifted without him noticing exactly when. The accumulation of small repetitions had created capacity for insight that wasn't there before. You're looking for the day that changes everything, the breakthrough moment, the sudden awakening, the instant when it all clicks into place. Those moments exist, but they emerge from hundreds of ordinary days of small effort that seem to accomplish nothing at the time. Small steps build wisdom, but how do we know when to speak and when to stay silent? That's the 6th lesson, and it determines whether your wisdom helps or harms. The Buddha had just achieved enlightenment beneath the Bodhi tree. After 49 days of sitting in meditation, he'd broken through to complete understanding of suffering and its end. Now he was walking toward Benares, where he would teach for the first time, and his face carried something that made people turn and stare. On the road, he encountered a wandering ascetic named Upaka. Upaka noticed immediately that this man walking toward him was different from other spiritual seekers he'd met. The Buddha's eyes were clear. His movements had an ease that comes from being completely free of inner conflict. His presence radiated a peace that Upaka had never encountered. Upaka stopped him. "Friend, your face is bright. Your senses seem clear and calm," he said. "Who is your teacher? Whose teachings do you follow?" This was a respectful question in a culture where spiritual authority came from lineage and tradition. You studied under a master, learned their techniques, and passed them on to others. The assumption was that anyone who'd achieved something worthwhile must have received it from someone greater. The Buddha answered directly and honestly. "I have no teacher," he said. "There is no one like me in this world. I am the one who has fully awakened. I have no equal among gods or humans. I am going to the city of Benares to set in motion the wheel of truth, to teach what I've discovered to those who can receive it." He wasn't boasting. He was stating facts about his realization with the same matter-of-fact clarity you'd use to describe the weather. This was a moment of incredible opportunity. Upaka was standing in front of the first, fully enlightened being in generations, receiving a direct invitation to learn what had just been discovered. Upaka looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe so, friend," shrugged, and walked past him down the road. Maybe so. 2 words that dismissed the most important encounter of Upaka's entire life. He'd asked a question, received an answer that should have stopped him in his tracks, and instead, he essentially said, "Whatever," and kept walking. The tragedy isn't that Upaka rejected the Buddha's teaching after careful consideration. The tragedy is that he didn't actually listen to what was being offered. His mind had already decided what kind of answer was acceptable. Something about a famous teacher, a recognized lineage, credentials he could verify. When the Buddha's answer didn't fit that predetermined framework, Upaka dismissed it without actually hearing what was being said. This is what most people do most of the time. They ask questions, but they're not actually seeking answers. They're seeking confirmation of what they already believe, validation of their existing framework, permission to continue thinking exactly as they've been thinking. When someone says something that doesn't fit, the immediate response is, "Maybe so," a polite dismissal that allows you to move on without the discomfort of actually considering whether you might be wrong about something important. The Buddha didn't chase after Upaka. He didn't try to convince him or prove his realization. He'd spoken truthfully when asked a direct question, and Upaka's response showed he wasn't ready to receive the teaching. So the Buddha continued to Benares and found students who could actually listen. This story teaches two connected lessons about speech and listening. First, speak truthfully, even when the truth won't be welcomed. Second, listen with the willingness to be changed by what you hear. The Buddha could have lied to Upaka, could have invented a prestigious teacher to make his claims more acceptable, could have softened his words to avoid seeming arrogant. Instead, he spoke plain truth. "I have no teacher. I discovered this myself. What I found is complete." The words were accurate, spoken at the right time in response to a direct question, and delivered without hostility or pride. That's what the Buddha meant by right speech. Not flowery language or diplomatic evasion, but words that are true, helpful, timely, and spoken with good intention. Most speech fails at least one of these criteria. You say things that are true but not helpful, criticizing someone in a way that serves your need to vent rather than their need to grow. You say things that might be helpful but aren't true, empty reassurances that make someone feel better temporarily, but don't address reality. You say true and helpful things at the wrong time, offering unsolicited advice when someone just needs to be heard. The Buddha's speech to Upaka was true, potentially helpful if received, perfectly timed as a response to a direct question, and spoken with the intention of sharing what had been discovered. It was right speech, even though it wasn't received. But Upaka's failure was in listening. He heard the words, but he didn't receive them. His mind was too busy judging whether the answer fit his preconceptions to actually consider whether it might be true. You do this constantly. Someone is talking and you're already formulating your response, waiting for them to finish so you can say what you've prepared. They're sharing something that challenges your worldview, and you're busy dismissing it before they've completed their sentence. They're offering perspective you need, and you're scanning their words for flaws, so you can reject the whole message based on a single questionable detail. This isn't listening. This is waiting to talk while someone else makes sounds. Real listening requires something upaka didn't have: the willingness to be wrong about what you think you know. If you've already decided what's true, what's possible, what's acceptable, then you're not listening, you're filtering. Only information that confirms your existing beliefs makes it through, and everything else gets the maybe so treatment. The cost of this is immense. Upaka walked right past enlightenment because the Buddha's answer didn't match his expectations about how enlightened people should talk. How many times have you walked past answers because they came from unexpected sources or sounded different from what you anticipated? Maybe it was advice from someone younger than you that you dismissed because what could they possibly know that you don't? Maybe it was insight from someone you'd categorized as less intelligent, less educated, less successful. Maybe it was truth spoken by someone you'd already decided was wrong about everything. The wisdom was there, available, being offered directly to you, but you were like Upaka, already walking past it saying, maybe so, because the packaging didn't match what you were looking for. Right speech matters because it determines whether truth can be transmitted. But wise listening matters even more because it determines whether truth can be received. The Buddha spoke perfectly to Upaka, and it accomplished nothing because Upaka wasn't actually listening. Think about conversations you've had recently. Were you truly listening, or were you waiting to talk? When someone said something that contradicted your existing beliefs, did you actually consider whether they might be right, or did you immediately start marshalling counter-arguments? When someone offered a perspective you hadn't considered, did you receive it with genuine curiosity, or did you dismiss it to maintain your current understanding? The Buddha taught that right speech has 4 qualities. It's truthful, it's beneficial, it's timely, and it's spoken kindly. But he also taught that even perfect speech is useless if no one can hear it. Upaka asked the right question. He recognized that something unusual was present in the Buddha. He made the effort to stop and inquire. But when the answer came in a form he didn't expect, he couldn't receive it. His filters were set to accept only certain kinds of responses, and the truth didn't match the filter settings. You have similar filters operating right now. Certain sources you trust automatically, and others you dismiss automatically. Certain types of answers you consider possible, and others you reject before investigation. These filters are supposed to protect you from wasting time on nonsense, but they also prevent you from receiving truth that arrives in unexpected packages. The solution isn't to blindly believe everything anyone says. The solution is to actually listen before deciding whether to accept or reject. Give the words a chance to land, to be considered fully before your pre-existing framework dismisses them. Upaka never found out what he'd missed by walking away. Later, when the Buddha became famous and people spoke of his teaching with reverence, did Upaka remember that roadside encounter? Did he realize he'd been offered direct access to what thousands were now seeking, and he'd dismissed it with, "Maybe so"? The story doesn't tell us, but the lesson remains. The cost of not listening is missing what you most need to hear. Your speech shapes how others can receive truth from you. Your listening shapes how you can receive truth from others. Both matter equally in the transmission of wisdom. The Buddha spoke clearly to Upaka. This is what I've discovered. This is where I'm going. This is what I'm offering. That was right speech. Truthful, beneficial, timely, kind. But Upaka's listening was wrong, filtered through preconceptions, closed to possibility, ending in dismissal. So the meeting that could have transformed Upaka's entire existence became just a brief, roadside conversation that he walked away from, carrying his questions to other teachers who would give him answers that fit his expectations better, even if those answers were less true. You're in conversations every day where something real is trying to reach you. Maybe it's buried in clumsy words from someone who doesn't communicate well. Maybe it's coming from a source you've categorized as unreliable. Maybe it's arriving in a form that challenges beliefs you've held for years. Will you hear it? Or will you, maybe so, your way past it, like Upaka walked past the Buddha? Right speech means speaking truth at the right time for the right reasons. Wise listening means receiving what's spoken without letting your filters reject it before you've actually heard it. Both are necessary for wisdom to move from one mind to another. Speaking wisely matters. But what about when others attack us with their words? When speech comes not as teaching, but as assault? That's when the seventh lesson becomes essential. Learning to meet hatred with something it can't destroy. A Brahmin named Akosa Bharadvaja heard that one of his relatives had become a follower of the Buddha. This news infuriated him. In his mind, the Buddha was a fraud who seduced people away from proper religious practice, a wanderer with no real authority who convinced gullible people to abandon their traditions and families. Akosa decided to confront this so-called teacher directly. He found the Buddha sitting calmly beneath a tree and immediately unleashed a torrent of verbal abuse that would have devastated most people. He called the Buddha a fool, a fake, a corrupter of good families, a shameless beggar who contributed nothing to society. He questioned the Buddha's lineage, his teaching, his right to speak on spiritual matters. The insults were personal, vicious, designed to wound and humiliate. The Buddha sat quietly and listened until Akosa ran out of words. Then In the silence that followed the storm of abuse, the Buddha asked a simple question. Tell me, Brahmin, do you sometimes have guests visit your home? Akosa was confused by this shift but answered, yes, sometimes. And when guests visit, do you offer them food? Yes, of course, Akosa said, still not understanding where this was going. And what happens if you offer them food but they don't accept it? The Buddha asked. What happens to the food if your guests decline to eat it? Akosa frowned. Then it remains mine, obviously. If they don't take it, it still belongs to me. The Buddha nodded. Just so, Brahmin. You have come here and offered me insults, abuse, and hatred. But I do not accept them. Therefore they remain yours. You are the one who must carry them home. You are the one who will sleep with them tonight. They belong entirely to you because I have not taken possession of them. There was a long silence as Akosa absorbed this. He'd come to wound the Buddha and instead found himself holding a mirror to his own anger. The Buddha wasn't damaged by the insults because he simply hadn't accepted them as truth about himself. They were just sounds Akosa had made, and the Buddha had let them pass by like wind through trees. Then the Buddha continued, his voice still calm, still kind, despite everything Akosa had just said. When you abuse and insult someone who does not return abuse for abuse, that abuse returns to you like dust thrown against the wind. You cannot hurt someone who refuses to be hurt, but you certainly hurt yourself in the attempt. Something broke open in Akosa's chest. He'd come expecting a fight, hoping to prove the Buddha was as petty and defensive as anyone else when attacked. Instead, he'd encountered something he'd never experienced, genuine compassion in the face of genuine hatred. The Buddha wasn't pretending to be unaffected or suppressing anger. He actually felt no anger, no need to defend himself, no desire to hurt back. Akosa sat down heavily. Teach me, he said quietly. Teach me how to be like this. The Buddha's response teaches something crucial about how to handle attacks, whether they come from ancient Brahmins or modern internet comments, from family members or workplace enemies. The teaching isn't about being passive or allowing abuse to continue. It's about understanding that hatred can only harm you if you accept it, internalize it, and let it determine how you see yourself. When someone insults you, they're making an offer. They're offering you their judgment, their anger, their assessment of your worth. You can accept that offer, take it in, believe it, carry it with you, let it shape how you feel about yourself. Or you can decline it, the way you decline food you didn't want, and let it remain theirs. Most people accept every insult automatically. Someone says you're stupid, and you immediately feel stupid. Someone says you're worthless, and you start questioning your value. Someone says you're failing, and you begin to believe you're a failure. You take the poisoned food they're offering and swallow it without questioning whether it's actually true or nutritious. The Buddha's teaching points to a different possibility. You can hear the words without accepting them as truth. You can recognize that someone is angry, that they're trying to hurt you, that they're offering you their pain dressed up as statements about who you are, and you can choose not to take possession of any of it. This isn't about developing thick skin or learning not to care. It's about seeing clearly what's actually happening in moments of attack. Someone is suffering, and their suffering is expressing itself as an attempt to make you suffer too. When you see this clearly, compassion becomes possible even toward the person attacking you. Akosa was suffering when he came to insult the Buddha. He was angry about his relative's choice, threatened by teaching he didn't understand, afraid of changes happening in his world. That suffering came out as vicious personal attacks. But the attacks were never really about the Buddha. They were about Akosa's internal state, finding an external target. When you're attacked online by a stranger who calls you names, the attack isn't about you. They don't know you. They're projecting their pain, insecurity, or anger onto whatever target presents itself. You just happen to be available. If you take it personally, if you accept their assessment as meaningful information about who you are, you're accepting food from someone who's trying to poison you. When you're attacked at work by someone who undermines you or questions your competence, the same principle applies. Often these attacks come from people who feel threatened, insecure, or in competition for resources. The attack is about their internal state, not about your actual worth or capability. You can defend yourself practically, set boundaries, document interactions, protect your position without accepting their judgment of you as truth. When family members attack you with criticism disguised as concern, with judgments wrapped in, "I'm only saying this because I love you," you're being offered poison, labeled as medicine. They may genuinely believe they're helping, but that doesn't mean you have to swallow what they're serving. You can love them, maintain relationship with them, and still decline to accept their assessment of your life choices as binding truth. This is where compassion becomes radical. The Buddha didn't just refuse Akosa's insults. He felt genuine care for the man who was attacking him. He saw Akosa's suffering and responded to that rather than to the surface level of abuse. He offered teaching instead of retaliation, understanding instead of defense. Most people think compassion means being nice, speaking softly, avoiding conflict. But the Buddha's compassion was fierce and clear. He didn't pretend the insults weren't happening, or reassure Akosa that it was okay to attack him. He pointed directly at what was true. These insults belong to you, not to me, and you're the one who will suffer from carrying them. That's compassionate because it's honest. It gives Akosa a chance to see what he's actually doing to himself, which is the only way he can stop doing it. Compassion isn't letting people abuse you without consequence. It's seeing their suffering clearly enough that you don't respond to their attack with your own attack, which would just create more suffering for everyone. You can set boundaries, remove yourself from harmful situations, protect yourself from repeated attacks, all while maintaining compassion for the person who's attacking you. Think about someone who's attacked you recently. Maybe it was harsh words, maybe betrayal, maybe deliberate cruelty. Your first instinct was probably to attack back, to defend yourself, to make them hurt the way they hurt you. That instinct is natural and human, but it's also what keeps cycles of harm spinning endlessly. Akosa attacked the Buddha, expecting attack in return. When he didn't get it, when he received compassion instead, the cycle broke. His anger had nowhere to go because it wasn't being met with matching anger. He was left holding his hatred with no one to give it to, which made him finally see it clearly and recognize he didn't want to carry it anymore. You can do this, not by being superhuman or transcending normal emotions, but by seeing clearly what's happening when someone offers you hatred. They're in pain, and they're trying to share that pain by making you hurt too. If you accept their offering, if you believe their insults, internalize their judgment, let their attack determine your worth, they succeed in sharing their suffering with you. But if you see what's happening and decline the offer, if you let their words remain theirs while you stay grounded in what's actually true about you, then you break the transmission. Their suffering stays with them, which is sad, but honest. And you remain free from the additional suffering they were trying to create. This doesn't mean you feel nothing when attacked. The Buddha was human. He heard every word Akosa said. But he didn't let those words define him because he knew who he was independent of anyone else's assessment. That knowing is what made compassion possible even towards someone actively trying to harm him. When you know your own worth, when you're grounded in accurate understanding of who you are and what you're doing, other people's attacks lose their power to devastate you. They can still hurt. Words can always hurt, but they can't destroy your fundamental sense of self. And when they can't destroy you, you're free to respond with compassion instead of defense. Akosa left that encounter transformed, not because the Buddha convinced him intellectually or defeated him in argument, but because he experienced something he'd never encountered, being met with compassion when he offered hatred. That experience showed him a different possibility for how to be in the world, You create that same possibility every time you refuse to accept hatred that's offered to you, every time you respond to attack with clarity instead of counterattack. You show the person attacking you that there's another way, even if they can't receive that teaching in the moment. The Buddha's response worked with Akosa because Akosa was ready to see something different. Not everyone who attacks you will be ready. Some people will take your compassion as weakness and attack harder. Some will never understand that you're declining their offering rather than being too stupid or weak to respond. That's their journey, not yours. Your responsibility is to know when you're being offered poison and to decline it clearly, to see the suffering behind the attack and respond to that rather than to the surface hostility. To protect yourself practically while maintaining compassion for the person who's trying to harm you. None of this is easy, but it's possible, and it's the only way to break cycles of harm that would otherwise continue forever. Compassion protects us not by making us invulnerable to attack, but by preventing us from accepting attacks as truth about who we are. When someone offers you their hatred and you decline to take possession of it, you remain free while they remain trapped in the suffering they were trying to share. That freedom is what allows you to respond with genuine care for their well-being, even when they're actively trying to hurt you. Compassion protects us, but who should we surround ourselves with on this path? That question leads to the 8th lesson, understanding how the people around you shape who you become. In ancient times, there was a navigator named Suparaga, whose knowledge of the seas was unmatched in all the kingdoms. He could read the stars, interpret the color of water, smell approaching storms, and guide ships safely through passages that had destroyed countless vessels before. Merchants who sailed with Suparaga always returned with their cargo intact, while those who ignored his guidance often vanished into the ocean, never to be seen again. One year, a group of merchants organized an expedition to distant lands where precious gems and rare spices could be acquired for enormous profit. They invited Suparaga to navigate, and he agreed on one condition: they must follow his instructions completely, even when those instructions seemed strange or when they disagreed with his judgment. The merchants, knowing his reputation, accepted these terms. The journey began smoothly. Suparaga guided them through familiar waters, timing their departure to catch favorable winds, avoiding reefs that appeared on no maps, steering clear of currents that pulled unwary ships off course. The merchants congratulated themselves on hiring such skilled guidance. But several weeks into the voyage, they entered waters Suparaga recognized as dangerous beyond anything most sailors ever encountered. One morning, he noticed the water ahead beginning to glow with a strange, reddish light. He immediately ordered the crew to stop rowing and let the ship drift backward with the current. The merchants protested. "We're making good time," they argued. "The weather is perfect. The wind is favorable. Why would we stop now?" Suparga pointed at the glowing water ahead. "That is the Sea of Fire," he said quietly. "The water itself burns there, hot enough to boil the flesh off your bones. We must go around, even if it adds weeks to our journey." Some merchants wanted to investigate, to see for themselves whether this legendary danger was real or just superstition. But they'd agreed to follow Suparaga's guidance, so reluctantly they ordered the crew to turn the ship and take the longer route he recommended. As they sailed past at a safe distance, they saw steam rising from water that bubbled and churned with heat that would indeed have killed them all. Days later, Suparaga noticed the dolphins and fish that usually accompanied their journey suddenly disappear. The water turned an unusual shade of dark blue, almost black. Again, he ordered the ship to change course immediately. Again, the merchants questioned him. "The water looks fine," they said. "We see no danger." "That is the Sea of Demons," Suparaga explained. "Creatures live in those depths that will drag ships down to feed on the crew. You cannot see them until it's too late, but the absence of normal sea life tells me they're there." This time, having seen the reality of the Sea of Fire, the merchants trusted his warning without argument. They sailed around the dangerous waters, and though they saw nothing that confirmed Suparaga's claim, they later met another ship that had ignored similar warnings. That ship had lost half its crew to something in the dark waters before escaping. The journey continued with Suparaga warning of dangers the merchants couldn't see and couldn't have anticipated on their own. Time after time, his guidance saved them from disaster. When they finally reached their destination, acquired their precious cargo, and returned home safely, the merchants understood something profound. Their survival had depended entirely on choosing to follow someone who knew things they didn't know and could see dangers they couldn't see. The Buddha told this story to illustrate what he considered the most important factor in spiritual development: the people you choose to travel with. Not just any companions, but those who have navigated these waters before and can guide you past the dangers you don't yet recognize. In the Buddha's teaching, spiritual friendship, having wise companions who support your growth, is not just helpful, it's essential. He said that good friends are the entire spiritual life, not just part of it. Everything else depends on whether you're traveling with people who lift you toward wisdom or drag you towards suffering. Think about the people you spend the most time with right now. Are they like Suparaga, guiding you past dangers you don't yet see? Or are they like merchants who would have sailed straight into the sea of fire because they couldn't imagine water could burn? The people around you shape who you become, whether you notice it or not. Spend time with people who complain constantly, and you'll find yourself complaining more. Spend time with people who see obstacles as interesting challenges, and you'll start seeing your own difficulties differently. Spend time with people who lie casually, and you'll notice your own relationship with truth becoming more flexible. Spend time with people who keep their word, and you'll find yourself becoming more reliable. This isn't about moral judgment or thinking you're better than anyone else. It's about recognizing that you're influenced by your environment in ways you often don't consciously register. The merchants didn't become better navigators by sailing with Superaga, but they became people who made better choices because they had access to his wisdom. The question is, who has access to wisdom that you need? And are you actually listening to them? You probably have people in your life right now who see things more clearly than you do in certain areas. Maybe they've been through difficulties you're currently facing. Maybe they've developed skills you're trying to build. Maybe they have perspective on your blind spots that you can't see from inside your own mind. Are you following their guidance like the merchants followed Superaga? Or are you dismissing their warnings because you can't yet see the dangers they're pointing to? But there's another side to this teaching that's equally important. Are you traveling with people who will actually follow wise guidance? Or are you surrounded by people who insist on sailing into every sea of fire to prove to themselves that it's real? Some people reject good advice reflexively. They have to learn everything the hard way, have to touch every hot stove personally, have to experience every consequence directly before they'll believe it exists. These people are exhausting companions on any journey because they constantly steer the group toward preventable disasters. The merchants in the story were wise not just because they hired Superaga, but because they'd agreed in advance to follow his guidance, even when they didn't understand it. That agreement, that willingness to trust someone who knows more than you do, is what made their safe passage possible. Who in your life keeps steering toward obvious dangers despite being warned? Who keeps making the same mistakes while ignoring everyone who tries to help them see the pattern? These people need compassion, but you don't need to be on their ship when it sails into the sea of fire. The Buddha was blunt about this. If you want to develop wisdom, you need to limit time with people who actively oppose wisdom. Not because they're bad people, but because their influence is strong and you're more susceptible to it than you think. This is especially true for people who mock your attempts to grow. When you try to break a harmful habit and someone laughs at you for trying, that's not neutral. When you set a boundary and someone pressures you to abandon it, that's not harmless. When you're working towards something difficult and someone constantly tells you it's pointless, that's not just their opinion, it's actively working against your development. The merchants could have brought people on their journey who second-guessed every decision Superaga made, who insisted on investigating every danger personally, who treated his expertise as just one opinion among many. If they had, some of those people would have died in the sea of fire, and their deaths might have caused others to lose faith in Suparaga's guidance. By being selective about who came on the journey, they protected not just themselves, but the integrity of the guidance itself. You need to be equally selective, not in a harsh or judgmental way, but in a clear recognition that your time and energy are finite. Every hour you spend with someone who drags you down is an hour you're not spending with someone who could help you grow. This doesn't mean abandoning people who are struggling. Suparaga guided the merchants even though they didn't have his knowledge or skill. The difference is that they wanted to learn, they were willing to follow guidance, they recognized their own limitations, and trusted someone who could see further than they could. People who are struggling but genuinely trying to grow are different from people who are content to stay stuck and want you to stay stuck with them. The first group needs support and guidance. The second group needs to experience the consequences of their choices before they'll consider changing, and you can't do that work for them. Look at the last 5 people you spent significant time with. After being with them, did you feel more capable or less? More hopeful or more cynical? More clear about what matters or more confused? More energized to tackle your challenges or more drained and discouraged? Your nervous system is responding to these people at a level below conscious awareness. Their energy affects your energy. Their perspective influences your perspective. Their habits become your habits through a process of unconscious mimicry that no amount of willpower can completely override. The Buddha taught that association with wise people is like living in a sandalwood forest. Even if you're just a normal tree, you'll absorb the fragrance. Association with unwise people is like living near a fish market. Even if you're fresh to start with, you'll absorb the smell. You're absorbing something from everyone you spend time with. The question is what you want to absorb and from whom. Suparaga couldn't have guided the merchants if they'd refused to let him. His knowledge was useless to people who wouldn't listen. Similarly, the wisest people in the world can't help you if you're not actually open to their guidance. So the teaching has 2 parts. Choose companions who have wisdom you need and actually be someone who can receive guidance when it's offered. The merchants succeeded because they did both. Who in your life right now is like Suparaga? Who sees things you don't see? Who has successfully navigated waters you're just entering? Who offers guidance that seems strange but comes from genuine experience? Are you listening to them? Or are you so convinced you know better that you're sailing straight toward dangers they're trying to help you avoid? And equally important, are you surrounded by people who trust good guidance when they receive it? Or are you traveling with people who insist on personally confirming every danger before they'll believe it's real. The quality of your journey depends on both. Good guidance available, but not followed, doesn't save anyone. Willingness to follow guidance but no access to wisdom means learning everything the hard way. You need both, wise companions and the humility to actually trust them when they warn you about dangers you can't yet see. Good friends guide us past dangers we don't recognize and toward possibilities we haven't imagined. But what about giving to others? That's the 9th lesson, and it reveals something counterintuitive about the relationship between giving and receiving. There was a boy named Gosaka who had no parents and no home of his own. When his mother and father died, distant relatives took him in, not out of love, but because no one else would, and they didn't want the shame of leaving a child to starve in the streets. From the moment he arrived, they made clear he was a burden they resented carrying. They housed him in a corner of the storage shed where grain was kept. They fed him scraps left over after everyone else had eaten, and only enough to keep him alive for the work they demanded. While the family's own children attended school and played, Gosaka worked from before sunrise until after dark, hauling water, grinding grain, cleaning, doing whatever tasks the adults considered too menial for their own children. He owned one ragged piece of cloth for clothing. He had no shoes. He slept on bare ground. The family never called him by his name, only boy or you there, as if giving him a name would acknowledge he was human rather than just unpaid labor. One day, after Gosaka had worked since dawn without rest, the family finally gave him his daily meal, a small bowl of rice, gruel so thin you could see through it, with no vegetables, no spice, nothing but grain and water boiled together. It was barely enough to sustain someone his age who did heavy physical work all day, but it was all he would get until the next morning. Gosaka took the bowl and walked to a quiet corner to eat. He was raising the first spoonful to his mouth when he saw a monk walking past on his arms round. The monk carried his bowl carefully, and from his measured pace and calm demeanor, Gosaka could see this was someone who had dedicated his life to understanding suffering and its end. Something shifted in Gosaka's chest. Here was a person trying to find freedom for all beings, walking past right now, and Gosaka had something he could offer. It didn't matter that what he had was barely enough for himself. It didn't matter that if he gave it away, he would go hungry until tomorrow morning's meager portion. It didn't matter that the monk hadn't asked for anything, or even looked in his direction. Gosaka stood up and approached the monk. "Venerable sir," he said quietly, holding out his bowl of thin gruel, "please accept this offering." The monk looked at the boy, ragged, thin, clearly in poverty himself, and then at the watery gruel that was obviously his only meal. "This is your food," the monk said gently. You need it more than I do. But Gosaka insisted. I want to give this, he said. Please don't refuse it. There was something in the boy's eyes that made the monk understand this wasn't about the food itself. This was about a heart that wanted to give despite having almost nothing, that found joy in generosity, even from a position of complete poverty. The monk accepted the offering with a blessing, and Gosaka watched him walk away, carrying the thin gruel that had been meant to sustain a child through another day of hard labor. Gosaka felt no regret. His stomach was empty, but his chest felt full, almost warm, in a way he'd never experienced before. For the first time since his parents died, he felt like himself, rather than just a burden other people had to carry. The act of giving freely, expecting nothing in return, had returned something to him that poverty and mistreatment had almost taken away, his own sense of worth, independent of what others thought of him. That night, Gosaka died suddenly in his sleep. His young body, weakened by years of poor food and hard labor, simply couldn't continue. The family found him in the morning and felt nothing but relief. One less mouth to feed, one less problem to manage. But according to the teaching, Gosaka's consciousness didn't end there. The final intentional act of his life had been pure generosity with no thought of return, and that consciousness, shaped by that final act of open-hearted giving, continued into a rebirth in one of the heaven realms where beings experience the results of their most powerful kusala actions. The Buddha used Gosaka's story to teach about true generosity, not the giving that expects return, not the charity that comes with attached strings, not the donations made to look good or feel superior, but the giving that arises from genuine wish for others' well-being regardless of personal cost. Gosaka had every reason not to give. He was hungry. He would remain hungry. He had no guarantee of tomorrow's meal. He owed the monk nothing. No one would know if he kept the food for himself. But he gave anyway because something in him recognized that giving freely was more valuable than keeping fearfully. This is completely opposite to how most people operate. Most giving is transactional. You give money to receive tax deductions, give time to build your resume, give favors to create obligations others must repay, give gifts to receive gratitude and recognition. Even when you don't consciously think this way, there's usually some expectation lurking underneath the generosity. Watch what happens in your mind when you give something and the person doesn't respond the way you expected. You help someone and they don't thank you adequately. Notice the irritation that arises. You give someone a gift and they seem underwhelmed. Notice the deflation you feel. You do someone a favor and they don't offer to reciprocate. Notice the sense of being used. These reactions reveal that your giving wasn't actually free. It came with invisible strings attached, expectations you may not have been aware of until they weren't met. You thought you were being generous, but you were actually making an investment you expected would pay returns. Gosaka's giving had no strings because he had no position to bargain from. He couldn't give in order to look good. He was already at the bottom of social hierarchy, with no status to protect. He couldn't give to create obligation. He had no power to collect on debts. He couldn't give to feel superior. He was giving to a monk from a position of complete poverty. All he could do was give because he wanted to give, and that pure motivation made all the difference. Most people live with a scarcity mindset that makes true generosity nearly impossible. The belief is that there's not enough money, time, love, recognition, resources, so you must hoard what you have and only give when the return is guaranteed to be worth more than what you gave. This mindset turns every relationship into a transaction and every interaction into a calculation. You keep score in friendships. You track who called last, who paid for dinner, who did more emotional labor in the conversation. When the ledger feels unbalanced, you pull back, give less. Wait for the other person to even things up before you'll invest more. This isn't friendship. It's a business arrangement where both parties are trying to make sure they're not getting cheated. You keep score in families. You remember every sacrifice you made for your children or parents or siblings, and you expect those sacrifices to be acknowledged, appreciated, and eventually repaid. When people don't reciprocate the way you think they should, resentment builds and relationships deteriorate into silent battles over who owes whom what. You keep score in work. You do exactly what you're paid to do and nothing more, carefully measuring your effort against your compensation, making sure you never give the company more than they're giving you. This protects you from exploitation, yes, but it also keeps you trapped in resentment because you're constantly monitoring whether you're being treated fairly rather than focusing on the work itself. The scarcity mindset assumes that giving diminishes you. If you give something away, you have less, so you must be careful about when and how much you give. But Gosaka discovered what generous people throughout history have discovered. Giving from the heart actually increases something in you that matters more than what you gave away. When he handed his bowl to the monk, Gosaka lost his only meal. That's real. His stomach remained empty, but he gained a sense of agency he didn't have before, the experience of choosing freely rather than just enduring what others forced on him. He gained connection to something larger than his own survival. He gained the direct experience that even in complete poverty, he still had something valuable to offer. These gains aren't material, can't be deposited in a bank, won't pay rent or buy food. But they're real nonetheless, and they change how you move through the world. People who learn to give freely develop a different relationship to life than people who give only transactionally. They're less afraid because they've proven to themselves that giving doesn't destroy them. They're less resentful because they're not keeping score of who owes them what. They're more connected because generosity builds genuine relationship in ways transaction never can. This doesn't mean becoming a doormat or giving away everything you need to survive. Gosaka gave his meal in that specific moment because something in him recognized it as right action. He wasn't giving away every meal every day in some self-destructive pattern. He was responding to a genuine impulse toward generosity in a moment when that response felt true. The teaching is about the quality of giving, not the quantity. Gosaka gave everything he had in that moment, but what made the giving transformative wasn't the amount, it was the complete absence of expectation for return. You can give large amounts with strings attached, and it creates nothing but obligation. You can give small amounts with an open heart, and it creates genuine connection. Notice what you're expecting when you give anything: money, time, attention, help, gifts, favors. Are you expecting gratitude, reciprocation, recognition, a feeling of being a good person? These expectations aren't wrong, but they're not free giving. They're investments disguised as generosity. True giving, the kind Gosaka demonstrated, expects nothing and therefore can't be disappointed. You give because you want to give, and whether the person receives it well or poorly, thanks you or doesn't, reciprocates or doesn't, none of that changes the fact that you gave freely. The completion is in the giving itself, not in what comes after. This is incredibly difficult for people raised in transactional culture to understand. Everything in modern society teaches you to maximize return on investment, to never give without getting, to make sure every exchange benefits you at least as much as it benefits others. The idea of giving with genuinely no expectation of return seems naive, even stupid. But Gosaka's transformation, from enslaved orphan to someone reborn in a heaven realm, according to the teaching, came from exactly that naive, stupid generosity. He gave everything expecting nothing, and the act itself liberated something in him that no amount of strategic transaction could have touched. Generosity transforms us, not because we gain material rewards, but because the act of giving freely changes our relationship to having and not having. When you can give from a place of genuine openness, you're no longer imprisoned by fear of scarcity. You're operating from recognition that what you have is enough to share, that your security doesn't depend on hoarding, that connection matters more than accumulation. But can anyone truly awaken to this? Can anyone develop the wisdom and freedom that allows for this kind of generosity? That question leads to the final lesson: understanding your own capacity for transformation. In the rigid caste system of ancient India, there was a category of people considered so impure that their very shadow was thought to contaminate anyone it touched. These outcasts lived on the edges of towns, forbidden to use the same wells as others, banned from entering temples, relegated to the most degrading work that higher castes refused to do. Among these outcasts was a man named Sopaka, and even by outcast standards, his position was considered particularly low. Sopaka survived by collecting garbage that others threw away. He ate scraps that dogs wouldn't touch, wore rags he found in refuse heaps, slept in the open air because no structure would house him. When people of higher castes saw him approaching on the road, they would cross to the other side or turn back entirely to avoid the pollution they believed his presence carried. He'd lived his entire life being told, through 1,000 daily rejections, that he was fundamentally less than human. One day, the Buddha was walking through the town where Sopaka lived. Sopaka saw him from a distance, a respected teacher, surrounded by devoted followers, and immediately moved to get out of the way. He knew his place. Holy men were not for people like him. His very presence near such a person would be an insult. But the Buddha stopped. To the shock of everyone present, he walked directly towards Sopaka, looked him in the eyes, and spoke to him as if he were speaking to a prince, or a merchant, or a Brahmin, as if he were speaking to a human being whose capacity for awakening was equal to anyone else's. "Do you wish to be free from suffering?" the Buddha asked. Sopaka couldn't believe he was being addressed directly. Surely this teacher didn't realize who he was talking to, didn't understand that Sopaka was untouchable, that this conversation itself was breaking fundamental rules that kept society properly ordered. "Venerable Sir," Sopaka said, his voice shaking, "I am an outcast. I am not worthy to receive teaching from you. My presence pollutes everything around me. You should not waste your words on someone like me." The Buddha's response was simple and devastating to every belief Sopaka had internalized about his own worthlessness. "Birth does not make someone pure or impure," he said. "Actions make someone pure or impure. You have the same capacity for awakening as any Brahmin, any king, any person who has ever lived. The question is whether you want to develop that capacity." These words reached something in Sopaka that decades of degradation hadn't managed to completely destroy. Some part of him had always suspected that the caste system's judgments were arbitrary, that his circumstances of birth didn't actually determine his worth as a conscious being. But he'd never heard anyone in authority say it out loud. never had his intuition validated by someone the world respected. The Buddha began teaching Sopakkha right there on the road, in front of everyone. The other monks protested. Surely, the teacher couldn't mean to accept an outcast as a student. Higher caste people who'd been following the Buddha's teaching began to drift away, scandalized that he would pollute his teaching by giving it to someone they considered subhuman. The Buddha ignored all objections and continued teaching Sopakkha with the same attention and care he gave to his most promising students. And Sopakkha, freed from the belief that he was inherently incapable of understanding, received the teaching with a mind unclouded by the arrogance that sometimes prevented more educated students from seeing clearly. Within a remarkably short time, Sopakkha achieved full enlightenment. The man society had declared permanently polluted became completely free from the mental defilements that actually pollute consciousness: greed, hatred, and delusion. The man who'd been told his entire life he was less than human demonstrated the highest human capacity, complete awakening to the nature of reality and the end of suffering. The Buddha used Sopakkha's achievement to teach something that threatened the entire social order. Awakening is possible for anyone, regardless of birth, social status, education, past actions, or any other external circumstance. The capacity for enlightenment is inherent in consciousness itself, not granted by social position or accumulated merit. This teaching is directly relevant to how you see your own capacity for transformation. You probably don't live in a rigid caste system, but you've internalized other beliefs about why awakening isn't available to someone like you. Maybe you think you're not smart enough. You've seen people who seem to grasp spiritual concepts easily, while you struggle to understand basic teachings. You conclude that enlightenment is for naturally gifted people, not for someone with your limited intelligence. This is the same error the society made about Sopakkha, confusing external circumstances with internal capacity. Maybe you think your past disqualifies you. You've done things you're ashamed of, hurt people you can't make amends to, made choices you can't undo. You believe that awakening is for people with clean records, not for someone with your history. But Sopakkha's past didn't prevent his awakening. What mattered was his present intention and effort. Maybe you think you're too damaged. Trauma, mental illness, addiction, chronic pain. You carry burdens that seem incompatible with the peace and clarity that awakening represents. You imagine enlightenment is for people who start from a baseline of okay, not for someone starting from your level of difficulty. But the Buddha's teaching is specifically for people who are suffering, not for people who've transcended suffering through favorable circumstances. Maybe you think you're too ordinary. Awakening seems like something for extraordinary people, monks who dedicate their entire lives, mystics who have visions, teachers with decades of practice. You're just a regular person with a job and bills and relationships, trying to get through each day. How could someone like you possibly achieve what seems reserved for spiritual elites? But Sopaka was the opposite of elite. He was literally the lowest person in a society built on hierarchy. He had no education, no resources, no social support, no advantages of any kind. What he had was the same thing you have: consciousness capable of understanding and transforming itself. The Buddha's teaching to Sopaka applies equally to you. Your capacity for awakening has nothing to do with your circumstances and everything to do with whether you're willing to do the work of understanding and transformation. This isn't motivational rhetoric meant to make you feel better temporarily. It's observation of how consciousness actually works. The mechanisms that create suffering operate the same way in every mind, regardless of external circumstances. Therefore, the practices that end suffering work the same way in every mind, regardless of external circumstances. Sopaka didn't need special modifications to the teaching because of his outcast status. He needed the same understanding of impermanence, suffering, and non-self that every other student needed. His poverty didn't require different teachings about craving. His social rejection didn't require modified practices for dealing with aversion. The fundamentals were the same because consciousness is the same regardless of what circumstances surround it. What prevented Sopaka from receiving teaching wasn't his actual capacity. It was his belief that he didn't have capacity. He'd internalized society's judgment that people like him couldn't and shouldn't seek liberation. The Buddha's first teaching to him wasn't about meditation or mindfulness or ethical conduct. It was about correcting the fundamental error in how Sopaka saw himself. You're making a similar error right now, not because you're stupid or because your self-assessment is accurate, but because you've internalized judgments about who gets to awaken and who doesn't. These judgments didn't come from direct observation of consciousness. They came from cultural messages, past failures, comparing yourself to others, and the voice in your head that insists you're different from people who've successfully transformed. That voice is lying, not maliciously, but accurately. It's lying. You're not fundamentally different from anyone who's ever awakened. You have the same basic consciousness, operating under the same basic principles. What you suffer from, greed, hatred, delusion, the belief that happiness comes from getting what you want and avoiding what you don't want, is exactly what everyone else suffers from. The practices that free others from this suffering will free you from this suffering if you actually do them. Not might free you, not could free you if circumstances were different, but will free you because the relationship between practice and freedom is causal, not conditional on external factors. Sophaka proved this by achieving complete enlightenment, despite having every disadvantage society could impose. If awakening required favorable circumstances, he never would have achieved it. If it required high birth, extensive education, material resources, or social support, he was permanently disqualified. But it required none of those things. It required understanding and practice, both of which were available to him the moment the Buddha offered teaching, and he was willing to receive it. The same is true for you. Understanding is available. You're receiving it right now, in these 10 lessons. Practice is available. You can begin immediately with whatever circumstance you're currently in. The question isn't whether you have capacity for awakening. The question is whether you believe you have that capacity enough to actually make the effort. Most people don't fail at transformation because they lack ability. They fail because they don't believe they have ability, so they never commit fully to the practices that would develop it. They dabble, they try half-heartedly, they give up at the first difficulty because some part of them was waiting to fail anyway, expecting to confirm what they already believed about their limitations. Sophaka didn't have that option. The Buddha's direct teaching to him, "You have the same capacity as anyone," meant he either had to try fully or reject what was being offered. He chose to try fully, and that full effort revealed capacities he didn't know he had, because society had spent his entire life convincing him those capacities didn't exist. What would change in your practice if you fully believed you had the capacity for awakening? Not hoped you might have it, not suspected it was theoretically possible, but knew with certainty that the same potential that allowed Sophaka to achieve enlightenment exists in you right now. You'd probably practice differently. You'd take the teachings more seriously, instead of treating them as interesting ideas to consider. You'd actually do the practices consistently, instead of waiting until you feel motivated or circumstances are perfect. You'd work through difficulties instead of using them as evidence that this path isn't for you. The Buddha's teaching to Sophaka, and through him to everyone who's ever felt disqualified from awakening, is radically inclusive. If you have consciousness, you have the capacity to understand and transform that consciousness. Period. No exceptions, no prerequisites beyond willingness to practice. This doesn't mean awakening is easy or fast, or that effort doesn't matter. It means the barriers are in your understanding and habits, not in your fundamental nature. Change understanding and habits, and awakening becomes accessible regardless of every other factor in your life. Saparka's achievement didn't change the caste system or improve his circumstances. He was still an outcast in society's eyes, still treated as untouchable by most people. But he was completely free internally because he'd realized what the Buddha kept pointing to. Your worth and your capacity for peace don't depend on external circumstances or other people's judgments. You can realize this too, not by becoming someone different, not by fixing everything that's wrong with your life, not by earning the right through years of perfect practice. By recognizing that the capacity is already present, has always been present, is present right now, regardless of what you believe about yourself. These 10 lessons have guided millions of people over 25 centuries. They've worked for people with every advantage and people with none. They've worked for the educated and the illiterate, the healthy and the sick, the young and the old, people from every culture and circumstance imaginable. They can guide you too, not because you're special, but because you're human, and these teachings address the fundamental nature of human consciousness, regardless of individual variation. The path is simple, even when it's not easy. Practice the middle way, see things clearly, understand karma, live fully, take small steps, speak wisely, answer hatred with compassion, choose good companions, give freely, and know you can awaken. Start wherever you are, with whatever you have, knowing that your capacity is sufficient for the journey ahead. Ten lessons from a man who sat beneath a tree and saw clearly how suffering works and how it ends. Balance instead of extremes, clear seeing instead of distorted perception, understanding that actions have consequences you can't escape, living each day as if it matters because it does, building wisdom through consistent small steps rather than dramatic gestures, speaking truthfully and listening without filters, meeting hatred with compassion that protects you from accepting poison, choosing companions who guide you past dangers you don't yet see, giving without keeping score, knowing you have the capacity to awaken regardless of what you've been told about your limitations. These aren't religious commandments or spiritual ideals to admire from a distance. They're observations about how your mind creates suffering and how to stop creating it. The Buddha tested them in his own experience before teaching anyone else. Millions of people across centuries have tested them since and found them accurate. You can test them too, not by believing anything, but by practicing and observing what happens. Start with one lesson, whichever one speaks most directly to your current struggle. Practice it until you see results, then move to the next. The teachings are already complete. They're waiting for you to complete them through practice. Everything you need to transform suffering into freedom is here, has always been here, will always be here. The only question is whether you'll begin. Breathe. Rest. When you're ready, take the first step.